Tonight we begin the biur on the Maamar Eim Bechukosei that we started last week. Over the course of the years that these classes have been going on, we have not learned many biurim. As a rule, we've learned the Maamar and left the biurim. I don't think it's the very first time we've learned the biur on a Maamar of Natan Rebbe, but it's certainly not something we've done frequently. The concept of a biur in the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe is based on a number of premises. I suppose the most basic, the most significant reason why you have the Maamar this way is because the Alter Rebbe never would carry over a Maamar from a week to a week. The Rebbe once said in a Fabrengen, talking about the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash, that the concept of a hemshech, which means starting a Maamar 1 week and continuing it over a course of several weeks, is a Baal Tshuva model. A tzaddik every week speaks on that parsha, on that inyan, and that's it. And certainly by the Alter Rebbe, that's how it was. The Alter Rebbe said a Maamar on a parsha, the next Shabbos was a new Maamar. And the Shabbos after that was a new Maamar. So if the Alter Rebbe said a Maamar, and the Maamar was not that well understood, he would explain it. He would say a biur, and sometimes you have a biur libiur. There are instances even where you have a biur, libiur, libiur, and it all revolved around one Shabbos, around one weekend, or one period. The Alter Rebbe's Maamarim are extraordinary. They're amazing. There's no words to express how incredible the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe are, because there's so much of it. There's so many of it, and they're so creative. There's so much chiddush. Every Maamar, everything he touches is gold. And when you read the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe, you see that this person was davuk in something very, very high, very, very, very great, and as a fountain, as a mayanam, as gaber, pnimiyas HaTorah, new Torah, brand new Torah, spills out of him in an incredible, incredible way. But we know that when the Alter Rebbe said Chassidus, he was basically not in this world. The Alter Rebbe was in a totally other world when the Alter Rebbe said Chassidus. There's even a story where the Alter Rebbe said a Maamar, and they understood from the way the Alter Rebbe said the Maamar that the Alter Rebbe was completely not in this world. When the Alter Rebbe later asked to see the Maamar, and in fact I believe this is one of the Maamarim that the Alter Rebbe would edit, when the Alter Rebbe looked at the Maamar, he said, quote, says, a good drush, says, I'm a sudadik drush. It's a good Maamar, it's well organized. Now of course, a person says Torah, he knows whether it was good or it was organized or not. And of course the answer is, when the Alter Rebbe said Torah, he was more Bashamayim than he was Ba'aretz. And as a consequence, it was not uncommon for the Alter Rebbe to say Torah, and for the Alter Rebbe not even to know what he said. And of course, as a consequence, it was conceivable, it was quite realistic, the Alter Rebbe should say a Maamar, and Chassidim, even great Chassidim, even the Mittel Rebbe, should have trouble understanding the Maamar. We've talked about this in the past, that the Alter Rebbe was incredibly precise about Lashon Harav. He wanted people to write what he said verbatim, word for word. He spoke in Yiddish, they wrote in Hebrew. They had to write the Hebrew in Yiddish and Hebrew word for word. And as I've told you so many times in the past, that's why the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe are filled with Hebrew double negatives, because it's really Yiddish in Hebrew, like Nisht Faran, Lo Yesh, Norva Den, Ela Rak. These are forms that are totally ungrammatical in Hebrew, because it's actually Yiddish grammar, and the people who wrote the Maamar with the Alter Rebbe, and there are really only 5, the Mittel Rebbe, Reb Moshe, the Alter Rebbe's youngest son, the Alter Rebbe's brother, the Maril, the Alter Rebbe's grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Pinchas Reizes. They were the only ones authorized to write the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe. Reb Aaron Strashela tried, and the Alter Rebbe was makpid, that they write word for word. And when the Alter Rebbe spoke, and they didn't understand, they would ask the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe would give a biur, explain. Sometimes there was a biur, and a biur libiur, and so on. I've told you the story in the past, how once the Alter Rebbe said a Maamar, and the Mittel Rebbe did not understand it, so he came to his father and asked for the biur, and the Alter Rebbe did not respond, so he got sick. He got sick physically. So his mother, the Rebbetzin Sterna, the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin, came into her husband and says, you're a cruel man, you're a nachzir. Your son wants something from you. You have it. It doesn't cost you anything. And what are you playing around with him? So the Alter Rebbe smiled and he said, Zog Berel soll sich nicht sorgen, es wird sein der Bier. Tell Berel not to worry. I'm going to explain it. Why the Alter Rebbe lechatchila didn't? But the biyurim of the Alter Rebbe are clarifying the Maimer. And there are different types of biyurim. Some of the biyurim are really a repeat of the, especially the repeat of the Maimer. He said it again, explaining different points, elaborating on points that he was more concise in the first version, being more concise on points that he elaborated in the first version, and so on. But sometimes you'll come across a beer of the Alter Rebbe that it doesn't sound like a maimer, it sounds partially like a conversation. The Alter Rebbe said a maimer, they didn't understand it, they came to him, they asked a question, he gave an answer. They asked a question, they gave an answer. It's a series of points. And the impression you get is Alter Rebbe Pasha sat and had a shmuas with the person or people who had had a difficulty with the maimer, and he Pasha clarified things. The beer we have in front of us can't exactly say that the Alter Rebbe is answering questions and making points. But to some degree at least, the Alter Rebbe is taking out of the Maimer, he said, that we learned last week, individual aspects and developing them. For example, the part of the Maimer we're going to learn tonight, at least we're planning on learning tonight, is about Oisius. Oisius HaMachshava, Oisius HaDibur, Oisius HaChakika, which is one of the many points we had in the Maimer. And Alter Rebbe is going to go off into an incredibly lengthy discussion about letters. It becomes almost a Maimer unto itself. In other words, even though it's a clarification on an existing Maimer, and he's explaining something that he said in the Maimer, but it's so developed, it's so elaborate, it's almost like a whole new thing. And as it turns out, this particular Maimer, as we're going to learn it, this particular section of the Maimer, is incredibly askoldic. It's a piece of scholarship, a piece of philosophy. That in the Maimorim of the later Rabbeim, like for example in the Anat, or in the Samach Reish and Zayin, topics like these would be developed and discussed at great length as a world, as an entity unto itself. In other words, Alter Rebbe would teach Chassidus. And in teaching Chassidus, he wouldn't only develop ideas, he'd create ideas. And sometimes when he would create the idea, he would create it in a very, very concise way. And in the beer, the idea would be developed much, much more. And that's what we have, an idea which was part of a maimer, or it was part of an explanation in a maimer, will now become an entity unto itself, a world unto itself. And it's as though what we're going to be learning is, on the one hand, a commentary on last week's maimer, and on the other hand, it's a whole new reality which the Alter Rebbe is developing, which is very interesting and very significant, and also very far-reaching in terms of its meaning from a Haskalah perspective, from a Avodah perspective, and so on. But in learning it here, I don't know if you go as far as developing the meaning and understanding the ramifications of it, but you certainly go away understanding a very meaningful philosophical idea, which is very, very important to understanding Oisius, words, letters, as you'll see Mitzvah Shem in tonight's class. So we're going to begin learning. We're going to learn a little bit of the text, and then I'm going to pause and give you a far greater introduction than the introduction I've given you so far. To very briefly summarize the maimer that we learned, which we're now going to learn the beer. The maimer that we learned discusses the concept of halicha, being a mahalach, being in motion, moving. And of course the concept of being a mahalach, the concept of being in motion, means that you're tapped into the infinity, you're connected to Ein Sof. Because being in motion doesn't only mean you're standing still, being in motion means you're going beyond your nature, beyond the natural expectation. Every creation has a certain definition, and based on that definition, every creation has a certain expectancy. A creation who has a certain definition, who lives up to the expectancy that his definition provides, is called an Eimid, standing still, like a malach. Even if he's making huge leaps, if all of the leaps, all of the growth, all of the progress that he makes, that he achieves, that he accomplishes, is within the parameters of his predetermined teva, nature, then he's not growing. He's not moving. Halicha means going beyond yourself. So the Maamar says, Im Bechukosei telechu, a Jew as opposed to a malach, and taka neshama beguf can be a mahalach. Means he can move, he can grow, he can be in motion in a way which is exceeding his nature, which makes him basically godly, which makes him basically infinite, because he's not simply acting out what's been predetermined, but he's going beyond himself. And as I explained to you last week, the mashal which is brought in against Tshuva Perek Yud Beis, to illustrate this from the shadow, that on earth the shadow will move an inch, and in the heavens the sun will have traveled millions of miles. Because if you understand the Torah model, if the earth is stationary and the sun is rotating, so for the shadow to move an inch, which takes a number of minutes, the sun had to travel an incredible distance considering how far away from the earth the sun is, and the fact that the sun has to make a total, a complete rotation of the earth every 24 hours. So the shadow is moving a little bit. But what's happened in the heavens is huge. But in the mashal of the sun and the shadow, the sun is moving and the earth is standing still. So the shadow is moving based on the movement of the sun. The Alter Rebbe brings this mashal and reverses it. And he says, down here you do a little tiny thing, on high it's extraordinary, it's very, very great. Because when you compare a world to a world, there's a subjectivity, there's a relativism. And consequently, the little bit we do on this earth, since it's going beyond the nature and the limitations with which we were designed, on this world we're being a mahalach in a tiny way. And in the Elam Hal Yenim, those things are compounded, they're multiplied into being a mahalach in a gigantic way. So the Maamar told us, Im Bechukosei telechu, a yid has to be a mahalach. And then the Alter Rebbe said, how does a yid become a mahalach? And the teretz is Bechukosei. That there's different levels, and the level of a yid, the level of a Yiddish neshama, that a person needs to be tapped into, that a person needs to be in touch with, in order to be able to be a mahalach, is the madrega of chakika. Bechukosei is ACS chakika. In other words, there's different levels of the neshama. There's a level of the neshama compared to carved letters. Pardon me. There's a level of the neshama which is compared to written letters, and of course there's a level of the neshama which is compared to letters which are oral, which are Baal Peh. As you'll see in Mitzvah Shem in the later Shurim, we're going to be discussing that Bli Neder. The levels of chakika, the letters which are one with the stone, carved into the stone, as it is in the neshama, represent infinity. If a yid lives on a level of written letters, ksav, if a yid lives on a level of oral letters, he's not a mahalach. He's standing still. Because his relationship to the Oisius is limited and chutz lenefesh. So the Torah says, Bechukosei telechu, that if a person lives on a level of his neshama, which is the spiritual equivalent of carved letters of ACS Chakika, he becomes a mahalach. And then of course, Im Bechukosei telechu, there's many ways for a person to become connected to the madrega of the neshama, called chakika, which makes him into mahalach, and the Torah is asking and requesting that it should be through tefillah. That when you daven ein im ela lashon tachanunim, when you daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the davening should be on a level of chakika, the deepest levels of the neshama, and as a result, the person becomes a mahalach. So the biur, of course, is going to begin by repeating what our Maamar said. What is going to be the discussion of tonight's class? Again, at least as the way I'm planning it now. The discussion of tonight's class is going to be about the relationship between words, letters, and specifically letters or words that are carved, and infinity. Being a mahalach, a creation of Hashem, and in this case a physical human being, to be considered in motion, which means he's exceeding himself, he's achieving an infinity, is predicated on Bechukosei. It's predicated on the idea that he's accessing a level of his neshama, which is called chakika. So we need to define chakika. In order to define chakika, the Rebbe is going to give us a very long dissertation on letters, words, letters, and different types of letters, and demonstrate how Eisei Chakika, letters that are carved, which is a physical mashal, what they mean in the nefesh on an Eida letter level, brings the person in touch through this level of letters with the infinity of the neshama. And the fact that he's connected to this level of letters, which connects him to the infinity of the neshama, allows him to become a mahalech. So without any further ado, let's start to read. Line 130. Let's explain the root, the core, the essence of what we learned in the Maamar. But now we're going to learn a beer. As you can tell, the beer is very long. It's 3 times the size of the Maamar, and it'll take us at least 3 classes to get through it. We want to review the Maamar, and like I said to you before, with certain parts of the Maamar we're going to develop in such a way that it almost becomes a Maamar unto itself. Says the Rabbi, we must explain this pasuk im Bechukosei as the Alter Rebbe explained it. That there's a concept of the person being a mahalech, which means he's achieving transcendence of self, and is considered in motion. In motion, he Bechukosei dafka. It is only achieved when a person reaches a level of his neshama, which is the madrega Bechukosei, which is bechinas eisei hakika, the letters that are carved. I want you to know, I'm learning Bashkacha Pratis with my Barcham in Yeshiva, Tafshin Tezayin, my mother from 1956, and the Maamar which I'm currently learning with them is in Bechukosei, the same Maamar. It's based on this Maamar. But in that Maamar, the Rebbe adds something which the Alter Rebbe, at least so far, has not emphasized. The Rebbe talks about different levels of the neshama. And he says, Teilechu, you become a mahalach, you become in motion when you reach the deeper levels of the neshama, Bechukosei. But he asks a pasha tekasha. If you become a mahalach by reaching the deepest levels of the neshama, why do we connect it to words and letters? Why not say the levels of the neshama, which are beyond words and letters altogether? In other words, if the issue is that you have to reach the deepest levels of the neshama, namely Bechukosei, to become a mahalach, skip the letters, just go to the nefesh itself. And the Rebbe says in short, because there's another side to this coin. And the other side of this coin is that you have to bring something into this world. In other words, it's nice that you reach the deepest levels of the neshama. But the point is to reach the deepest levels of the neshama and bring it down. So the concept of oisius, of words and letters, represent gestalt, they represent physical form, they represent physical presence. And eisius, hakika means you're bringing into a gestalt, into a physical form. You're bringing down into this world letters that are very deep. So on the one hand, you're reaching the deepest levels of the neshama, which are infinite, and therefore you become a mahalach. On the other hand, you're bringing him into this world. Bechinas eisei lechi, that's not going to be letters. But they have to be letters that are carved, part and parcel with the stone, and you'll see later on that means in the nimshal, part and parcel with the person's neshama. So the Rebbe says, Yesh lahagdim tchil, we must preface first, sheirish in yana hefresh. The root that separates bein teirish b'ksav, between the Torah and the Sefer Torah, sheneslab shebe'eisius aksav, which is manifest in the written letters, b'dei alaklaf, and ink on parchment, lebechinas mechtav elakim, as opposed to the carving, the writing of elakim himself, the Eibishter himself, on the luches habris, on the tablets, choros ala luches, carved onto the tablets, shu eisei hakika, which is carved letters. Now, Hashem, in a later class, we're going to explore more mystically the luches habris, the Torah shebaksav, and the Torah shebal peh. For right now, we don't have to go into the mystical differences. We simply have to explain the difference between written letters and carved letters. Says the Rebbe on line 136, v'hafresh, what separates written letters and carved letters, physically, it's very, very obvious. 137. When you write letters using ink, obviously you're taking ink and you're superimposing it on a piece of paper or parchment. The ink is something unto itself. It's never one with the body and substance of the parchment. The parchment is a separate thing. And of course, in mysticism, the whiteness of the parchment represents Ein Sof, Sevel Kalaman. The blackness of the letters represent Memala Kalaman. But because the parchment is separate and the ink is separate, in other words, rather than understand that mystically that the ink is emerging from the parchment, the ink is coming from someplace else, so the superimposition of the letters over the parchment is two things coming together. When the ink is attached to the parchment, Yidbeku, they stick together. And they join together almost as one. And it appears as though they're one. The white parchment exists directly beneath the letter. All of mamish nichtev eis, and on top of the letter is placed. That the very, very space of the white is now the space of the black. The space of the parchment, the space of the letter. V'usevli, and the space tolerates it. So the argument is the joining together of ink and a paper is making two into one. And the Rebbe is not disagreeing with it. But at the same time, there remain two separate things. The parchment is one physical thing. The ink is another physical thing. They're separate. They're fusing together. You're manifesting as klaf halavan. The ink is joining the white parchment. That on the parchment you should see the image of letters of ink. Says the Rabbi, Im Kain, accordingly, the relationship between the parchment and the ink is as though one is becoming a garment, a clothing for the other. The whiteness of the parchment represents one idea, the blackness of the letter is a drape, is a garment, is a form that covers over that whiteness to make a statement. A white piece of paper, you can write anything you want on, you put letters on it, you define the ideas that you're putting on this piece of paper. But you're in effect defining the piece of paper, which is tolerating those ideas. But since you could have put any words on that piece of paper, even when you choose to put specific words and a specific idea on that piece of paper still tolerates potentially much, much more, because it's an imposition of one thing on another. That it should appear on the parchment. The image of letters from ink. And accordingly, it's a garment. The ink is a garment for the parchment. Just like a person puts on a shirt. The shirt is separate from your body. It decorates your body. The ink is a shirt which is decorating a piece of parchment. And even though that levush hamachuber tamid, that this ink, once it joins the paper, it becomes one. Once it joins the parchment, it becomes one. Nevertheless, mitzad atzmehu davar b'fnei atzmei, in and of itself it's distinct. Or to say it in other words, philosophically it's separate. The black ink and the white paper are philosophically two things. They're joining, but they're philosophically two things. And accordingly, that's how we understand the letters written with ink. On parchment, hey malbishim as a klaf, they become a garment to dress and to define, and to represent the parchment, bechinas levush levad, only as a garment. So written letters are the joining together of one thing and another, namely ink and paper or parchment, and they're always two. And in the Nimsho, there is a Yid and there is the fire of the Torah. And the joining of the Yid and the fire of the Torah on 11, where they're taka becoming one, but it's the unification of two separate things, is not mamish achdas. And accordingly, it doesn't reveal the Ein Sof of the Neshama. Line 147, Masha'ein kin beis yesach hakiko, when you're talking about carved letters. Shenecheko kim v'necher rotzim, they're carved and hewn out. Al gabi even tev, on a diamond and a precious stone or a semi-precious stone. U'kaigad and the like. In other words, you take the stone, you actually carve out of the stone letters, which represent what you wish to say. Those letters don't exist. The shapes of the letters exist, but there's no reality to the letters. Ink on a piece of paper, there is the shape of that ink, and there's the material, the actual substance of that ink, which is separate from the parchment. But when you carve out of a stone a letter, there's nothing but stone. To the contrary, the carving of the stone in the letter into the stone diminishes the volume, it diminishes the mass, it diminishes how much actual stone you have. There is no letter in a stone other than how it's the stone itself. Those letters do not constitute a garment, because they're from the essence. In other words, the stone as it exists in relationship with itself, and this substance of the diamond is considered a part of its body. Now, of course, physically, this is who cares? These kind of letters, as long as you can read it. But spiritually, it's an incredible who cares. When you join ink and a piece of paper, spiritually it means the Eibishter and you are joining you're two separate things. When you join letters and stone, spiritually this means you're joining the Eibishter and you together in such a way where you're not remaining two separate things, you're becoming one, so the difference is extraordinary. And that's the pshat, in Bechukosei telechu, bring you to an Ein Sof and you become a Mahalach. Vagam asks the Rebbe on line 150, is it not true? That still When you carve letters onto a stone, you've changed the stone. It's not the same thing as the stone was existed prior to the carving, before you carved out the letters. Initially, the stone was pashut, simple, plain, and of course radiant, belayed, seared, asias, cloud without any form of letters whatsoever. And through the carving, letters were born, letters emerged on the stone. And accordingly, the form of these letters, they remain separate from the stone as it is in its essence and its own substance, because the stone has no form. Without any letters. So the letters that are being added to the stone are foreign as far as the stone is concerned. And I want to say this before I keep reading. When you put a letter onto a stone, you carve a letter onto a stone, the argument is the stone has no form, has no shape, has no statement. You're putting letters onto the stone and giving it a statement. And of course the question is, the statement is coming from you, it has nothing to do with the stone. But the point you have to understand is, the stone could say, I don't want to be carved. The stone could say, I don't want to be carved, and it's carved in a particular way that it should have this particular image. In other words, the fact that you can carve out of a stone a letter, a shape, and it doesn't fall to pieces, for example, or it's not so hard that it doesn't tolerate the imprint, means that the definition of a stone, even in its plainness, is that it has the possibility to be carved into. And of course the nimshal is, you have a neshama, and the Eibishter could be carved into your neshama. He could be carved into your neshama in such a way where you become one. But the fact that you can carve the Eibishter into your neshama is a raya that your neshama, before the Eibishter was carved into you, was already tolerant, was already susceptible, was already open to the letters to the Eibishter being carved into the neshama. And the same is true when you carve a letter onto a stone. It says something about the stone's relationship with letters, that they're carvable. And this is what the Rebbe now says. However, you're right. The letters are being added to the stone as a foreign, as an alien thing. What is still true is that these letters, are part and parcel with the stone. Once you carve them, there's no separation between the stone and the letters. It's not separate at all. They're carved and they're chopped out, begufei mamish, in its body. And like I said earlier, physically, the relation between the stone and the letters seems to be arbitrary. You're just using the stone to speak the letters. But spiritually, you're saying the pshitas of Elokus is tolerating this histaidus, the pshitas of Elokus is tolerating this imprint. You're able to carve these letters onto this stone. This already shows on a relationship. It says the Rebbe, line 156, as opposed to letters written with ink. That are a separate thing, other than the parchment. And because they remain always separate from the parchment, it's like a garment which is separate from the one wearing it. As opposed to carved letters, that they also are like letters. As opposed to the plain white piece of parchment before you wrote any letters on it, and the plain stone before you carved any letters into it, in its own substance, in its relationship with itself, which is moved from every image. So there is a difference between how the letters appear on the stone and that the stone has no letters. Nevertheless, they are part of the body and the substance of the thing being carved. And therefore you can't call it a garment. The stone, if it had no relation with the Isis, would not allow itself to be carved. The fact that it's carvable is a right, has a relationship with Isis, and therefore we can speak of the Isis being one with the Evan as opposed to being separate from the Evan. So Isis HaChakika represent a fusion between stones and words that are much deeper. And the Nimshal is tapping into the Ein Sof of Elokus, using words. And the Isis HaKsav are like two separate things which are joining, that even though they're being joined, because they're separate thing, the infinity that is in one thing is not completely becoming one with the other thing, and as a consequence, the person remains an image. And then the Rebbe says on line 160, V'hinei, I just gave you a physical example of paper and stone and letters. Paper does not tolerate that letters should become one with it. Stone does tolerate that letters should become one with it. It's a raya that when the paper becomes one with the lakus, it's always separate, and when the stone becomes one with the lakus, they can take a joy. But it's a mashal gashmi, it's a physical mashal. And all of us understand physical mashal, they're very down to earth, they're very real, but they're also very, very difficult to comprehend. To take out of this mashal, that if I would have written letters, I would be a oimid. I would have carved letters, I would be a mahalach. Based on what we just read, it's very, very deficient. So the Rebbe is going to explain it. Nevertheless, using written letters and carved letters becomes an analogy to understand what's advantageous over the tablets, the tablets of the covenant, over the Sefer Torah, we're going to explain later on in the Maimon. Okay, so I gave you the part of the Maimon that I needed to read before I could begin my second and much more elaborate introduction, which is essentially a review of the last Maimon. In Bechukosei, when you serve Hashem at level of Chakika, Telecha, you become a Mahalach. Why? Because Eishes Chakika means reading into the Nefesh, where the Eishes are one with the Nefesh. And when you're reaching into the Nefesh on a level where the Eishes are one with the Nefesh, so you reveal the Nefesh itself, which is where the infinity lies. Now I want to stop the Maimon and give you an introduction about the whole sugya of Oises as it's found in Chassidus, particularly in the Geras HaKedesh Siman Hey, Vayas David Shem, which is mentioned here in this Maimon, as well as in Ranat and in Samach to Samach and in other places. So let's talk about the concept of letters. In Torah, and when I say, of course, Torah, I mean Pnimiyas Torah, I mean Kabbalah, and then, of course, in Chassidus, there's an absolute concept, absolutism, about the concept of a soul and a body. Obviously, a soul and a body is the fusion of two things. It's the fusion of something more material, more tangible, and more theoretical, more esoteric, more sublime. But the understanding of the relationship between these two things that Torah has is that the notion that there's a juxtaposition of something finer over something more material is not relative and not subjective, it's absolute. In other words, I don't want to use this example. I really don't, because I'm not an expert on it, and it's never the same thing. But in the theory of relativity, there is a notion that material, that matter, is really energy in an alternative form. That's all it is. You take energy and whatever is necessary to do it, then it became transformed into matter. You speed it up, you slow it down, whatever it is. You take material, you speed it up, it becomes energy. But we're not talking about the relationship between energy and matter. We're talking about a relationship between a spiritual thing, a non-physical thing, and a physical thing. And there's no relativism. In other words, it's not that the spiritual aspect, the sublime aspect, is the same stuff as the body which represents it, the body which carries it on a higher level. There is no such thing as an idea becoming a letter if it's brought down low enough. There is no such thing as an embodiment of something being raised up high enough and becoming a theoretical idea, the light or the spirituality that it represents. In other words, all the way back to the highest levels, a body and a vessel are two. Oiris and Kalim are separate. How high? Literally till Atzmos. Till the Kvayachal, the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are two completely different tracks. One is the track that represents bodies, embodiments, and the other is the track that represents theories and ideas, ruchnias. And they're always separate, which means if you have no body, you can have no soul. Because any kind of soul, whatever kind of soul it is, needs to be juxtaposed, superimposed on a form, on a body that carries it and represents it. If there is no body, there can be no soul. And the body is not just a lower version of what the soul is, it's absolutely something separate. Let me give an example. This is a childhood experience of mine, which I share as a way of making a simple point. We were children, we were city kids, so we didn't know what darkness was because there's always street lights until we went to camp. And in camp, of course, you can experience what black feels like, what darkness is. And we went on an overnight, on a bivouac. We went out to camp. And there's a fire, obviously, which can die eventually. But aside from the fire which is burning in the center of the camp, it's dark, other than the fact that there are stars in the sky, which of course a city person doesn't know. So as children, we'd put on a flashlight and there'd be a beam of light. And of course that beam of light was full of teeny tiny little particles that were floating around, that were swimming inside the beam. And in my childhood imagination, I would imagine if I could vacuum, if I could clean out of the beam of light those little tiny particles and have, in effect, clean light. Because to me, the beam of light was dirtied, was soiled by the thousands of little particles that were swimming in the space of the beam. What I, of course, did not understand is if I was successful at vacuuming out the particles that appear as dirt in that beam of light, the light would disappear. Because the reason I am seeing the light is because it's hitting those little particles and being immediately translated into heat and into visible light, and that's why I see it. In other words, if the light would travel through a vacuum, it would travel and travel and travel ad infinitum, and it would never be used up. You'd also never see it. What translates theoretical light and energy into actual light is that it bounces off something. That other thing is the garment or the letter or the conductor of the light. And if you don't have something to conduct the light doesn't shine. So the point that I want to make is that the relationship between light and what light represents in the Nimshal, which is everything spiritual, ideas, feelings, godliness, and the bodies that embody them, that represent them, and that carry them, that make them exist, is an absolute separation. There is no point at which those two things become one. They're absolutely separate. So, it's a fascinating interface. It's a meeting between two things. If you have no light, if you have no idea, if you have no feeling, if you have no meaning, there's no point in having bodies to carry that meaning. If you have no bodies, if you have no forms on which can be embodied, can be represented, ideas or feelings or light and so forth and so on, there can be no light. Just like everybody understands that if you have no guf, there can be no neshama. Without a body, there is no soul. Now, souls exist without bodies. They just don't exist physically. But they exist spiritually. But if you went up to those spiritual worlds, you would discover that the spiritual soul in that spiritual world is also a combination of a soul and a body. And if there was no metaphysical body in that world, the soul wouldn't exist. And if you were able to separate the body from that soul in the spiritual world, you'd be going to a much higher level. And at that higher level would be the same thing. Ultimately, if you were to separate a soul from a body, absolutely there'd be no soul. It would be God. The idea that something comes forward as a form, as a spiritually meaningful yet defined form must be juxtaposed against some kind of an embodiment. Something has to carry the light from the essence to make it manifest. According to Chassidus, you have a neshama. Hidden within your neshama is, for the sake of argument, every concept. Your soul knows everything. Your soul has every possible emotion, feels everything. But you don't. Why? Because as ideas and as feelings and as art forms exist in your soul, they're called pure light. The light of the idea, the light of the feeling, and the light of the sense. Pure light doesn't exist. In order for an idea to emerge from your neshama and to become an actual concept, it must have words. Those words are the container that carries the idea, but they're the container that contains the idea. Every light that comes forward from the neshama only emerges from the neshama if it's defined and held by some kind of a body. That body represents it, holds it, reveals it, and limits it. So your neshama has all the concepts in the universe. You have none. The moment a concept is going to emerge from your neshama into your mind, it must be defined. It must become limited by some kind of an embodiment. And this embodiment is called oisis. It's called letters. If there were no letters to carry the idea wouldn't exist. It would be part of the nefesh. And once those letters carry the idea, they also limit it. But it's a meeting between two things that are absolutely separate, all the way back until the etzem nefesh mamish. So what I'm saying is that in the neshama and in a lakus, kvayachal in creation, there are two separate types of reality, which we basically call body and soul, light and vessel, eid and keli, whose separation is not simply a matter that one is higher and one is lower, one is closer and one is more distant, but they're categorically distinct. And all the way back until the very, very highest levels, they will always remain separate. But there's more differences between these two systems of body and soul, light and vessel, other than the fact that they emerge separately from the nefesh, and lahavle emerge separately from Milikus. And I'll tell you what that difference is. If you have a concept, for example, the concept of 1 + 1 = 2, it's a very simple concept. And then you have a second concept, 2 - 1 = 1, or 2 + 2 = 4. So on a piece of paper, you write that down, you have three different equations. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 - 1 = 1, 2 + 2 = 4. But in terms of ideas, how many ideas do you have? It depends how smart you are. On the lowest level, you have three separate ideas. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 - 1 = 1 are totally separate ideas when you're in nursery. But as a child grows, a child matures, the whole point of the maturation is to begin to realize that there's unity. 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 - 1 = 1 is exactly the same idea. 1 + 1 = 1 and 2 + 2 = 2 is also the same idea. The difference is only in the numbers. And the same is true also, of course, of multiplication and division. In other words, as ideas ascend, as concepts in a person's mind go to a higher level, in a place where on a lower level you had many ideas, and a higher level you have fewer ideas. And the smarter a person is, the more they see the unity between the ideas until they become virtually one. I heard that the Rebbe once said in a Fabrengen that the Rogatchover said that the entire Teda is 1 point, but for me the Teda is Esen Nekudas. The Teda is 10 points. The Rogatchover was an incredible genius. And of course part of his genius is that he saw connections, he saw unity. So the Rogatchover says, I am a deep enough of an intellectual to see unity in Teda to the degree that the Teda is made up of 10 basic ideas. To the average person, the Teda is made up of thousands of ideas. He saw unity between those ideas that came down to 10. But he also said that if he was even more intelligent, if he was smarter still, he would be able to reduce that 10 into 1. So the higher an idea goes, the more the idea is fused. And the same is true also with emotions and with senses. The deeper and the finer somebody is, the more unity there exists. But the unity is only in what we call the light, the oir, an idea, a concept, which is understood on a lower level as separate from another concept, and a higher level becomes one. But the oisias are separate. 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 - 1 = 1 are one idea. They're different words. It's the same letters, but they're separate letters. In other words, when you understand something on a lower level, and at that lower level you have separate concepts. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 - 1 is two separate concepts. And you obviously have different words, different letters with which to say it. When you graduate to a higher level of understanding, where it becomes obvious to you that 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 2 minus 1 equals 1 is the same idea. Two ideas have become one, but the words that represent those ideas remain separate. In other words, when you go up to a higher level of understanding, you'll use different words to say the idea on the higher level. But the words that spoke that idea on the lower level never disappear. In other words, in the light arena, in the oir arena, there's unity. And the divisions are artificial. The reason there's a division between one idea and another, between one light and another, is for me and for you. And the simpler we are, the lower we are, the more divisions we need. The brighter we are, the deeper we are, the fewer divisions we need, so we have less division and greater unity. But the bodies, the letters, the words that carry those divisions are divided always. So if a person could be in world A, where there's a lot of ideas and a lot of words, and he ascends to world B, where there's fewer ideas and fewer words, it isn't that the words that he knew in world A have suddenly joined together in world B. Not true. They still exist. To use simple words, you can say something and you can think something. This is called Eisias HaDibur, this is called Eisias HaMachshava. Letters of speech, letters of thought. Or take it even to a lower level, you have written letters, which is words of action. Eisias HaKsav, Eisias HaDibur, words that you speak, and Eisias HaMachshava, words that you think. The concept is the same concept. The concept written on a piece of paper. The concept articulated with words. And the concepts thought in your own mind, your own imagination, is the same concept. The words are different. So the argument is that when you have a concept that's written on a piece of paper, which is elevated to a higher level where it's spoken, which is elevated to a higher level still which is being thought. So there's greater unity as you ascend from one world to another world in the idea. But the words were always separate. Hashem created separately letters of thought, letters of speech, and letters of action, and they never fuse. Every thing, every being, which is a body that carries a soul, is distinct till Atzmas Amhus. And that's why Chassidus explains that in your neshama, you not only have many letters. There's a famous quotation, which is mentioned in Tanya Gersa Kedesh Siman Hey, and it's repeated here in our Maamar. Hanefesh Atzma Maleya Eisias. The soul is filled with letters. You're not going to say Hanefesh Atzma Maleya Oir. The soul is filled with light. Why not? Because inside the nefesh, just as the nefesh is one, all the different lights are also one. When the light, which in a lower level is speaking many different ideas that are separate enlightenments, on a higher level, there's greater unity, so you have fewer enlightenments, but each enlightenment is more concentrated. In the nefesh itself, all light is one. But every word that is spoken, and every word that could be spoken, is separate in the nefesh. In a person's nefesh, there's a separate, so to speak, space for letters of written, letters of speech, and letters of thought, and there is no such thing as them ever joining together. In Hebrew, you would say it this way, and I saw this once in Samachei Shavuos, I didn't see it in any other place. Letters are always klal uprat. Letters in a higher level are more general, and a lower level are more specific. But the meaning of the word klal uprat is that when the details go up to a higher level, you have every single detail that just crunched together. Light is called hiyuli and gilui, or helem and gilui, or etzem and ispashtus. When the light is on a higher level, it's a different thing. It's no longer the same light, it's the higher light. 10 ideas on a higher level is one idea. 100 ideas on a higher level becomes 10 ideas. 10 ideas on a higher level become one idea, you have one light. But the oisias, the represented, always remain separate. Till atzmas amhus. Until the atzmas amhus of the neshama. So you have the meaning of two things. The light, the spirituality, the meaning, the purpose, the definition. And the words or the letters that are going to carry and represent and embody them. And the difference is that big words don't make little words, they're separate. Higher words don't create low words, they're separate. And the Eibishter created every kind of letter, every kind of word, in every single world that we should be able to communicate and be manifest and be represented and be revealed in all these different worlds. And in Atzmos, the letters, the Sfiras, the Kalim of every single world exist distinctly in Atzmos Amuz. As opposed to light. Light on a lower level is divided into little teeny lights. And a higher level they become more unified. And a higher level they become more unified still. And as they become more unified, they literally go from many to one. And that's the difference between Keli and Oyer, between Guf and Neshama, and Oisius and Oyer. Letters and ideas. Ideas are manifestations of the Neshama. And of course, if you understand an idea, it's a very small manifestation of the Neshama. But as you get smarter and more of your Neshama can be manifest, you can understand more. It's not more separate lights, it's a greater, higher light. As opposed to in the realm of Oisius, they're always distinct, they're always separate, they never really join. And that's the pshat, that in your Etzam HaNefesh, there's separately Oisius of Tainug, and Oisius of Ratzon, and Oisius of Chochmah, and Oisius of Pnimi has been, and Oisius of Chitzeni has been, and Oisius of Midas, and Oisius of Nehi, and Oisius of Machshava, and Oisius of Dibur, and Oisius of Maisa. Because letters don't have babies, and letters are not born. Atzmus Amhus creates the letters. I've mentioned this to you in a previous class that I saw once in the back of the Samach Vov, which of course now is printed as a separate krach. A short little mimer from the Rebbe Rashab, where the Rebbe Rashab quotes his father, the Rebbe Marash. And he says, this is the quote approximately, Reden darf man reden leiten Ede, und Atzmus Amhus gibt zu Asius. You speak to your community based on their intelligence, and God gives you words. In other words, you think about what you want to say, the ideas, which is the ruchnius of the neshama. As you speak, the words emerge from the nefesh, directly from Atzmos Amhus. Each letter, each word is distinct in the nefesh, and there's no joining letters together. So there's if you will, there's two concepts of infinity here. In the light system, in the oyer system, in the ruchnius system, the infinity is one light, one great light. In the Keli system, in the Guf system, in the Oisius system, there's literally an infinity of different types of letters. There's an infinity of different individual letters, because letters are separate. Higher letters do not create lower letters. One kind of letter does not create another kind of letter. Each letter is created separate in the nefesh. And if it did not exist in the nefesh, you would not be able to say it. You would not be able to have that form. Each individual form is created in Atzmos Amhus separately. So if you were to say, a physical thing on this earth, a stone, has a size, has a shape, has an image, has a definition, has a purpose, and then has an actual material. The spirituality of that stone, its shape, its density, its form, its purpose, its beauty, is part of the Ruchnias Dika system, where one stone and another stone are theoretically one idea, but the actual material of the stone is separate, and it comes directly from Atzmos Amhus Ein Sof Baruch. That's the difference between the Oyer system and the Keli system. So now, every single thing we experience and encounter and see is a fusion of these two ideas. Whatever you look at in the world is a combination of Eir and Keli, of Guf and Neshama. And of course, the rules that I established apply across the board. For example, you look at a table. A table is a physical thing, but a table is a concept with a human ingenuity and a human investment and a human preciseness. The concept of a table is one. The material of a table, every table is separate. And the same is true in nature. The Eibishter created things. Some of them are beautiful, some are not so beautiful. Some seem precise, some seem to be odd and imprecise. But there's always the ruchnius and there's always the gashmius. Everything you perceive is a combination of meaning and a body that is carrying the meaning. If you could theoretically separate those two things, the meaning of each individual aspect would become part of this great unity of meanings, like one light, but the material that the meanings are juxtaposed on are always separate. They never join, and like I said before, this goes back literally till Atzma Samhus. That's the meaning of the Alter Rebbe's statement, Hanefesh Atzma Maleya, Hanefesh Atzma Maleya Oisias. Having said that, Chassidus talks about different levels. In other words, when a body and a soul meet, when a light and a vessel meets, when ideas and words meet, there's different levels. Anytime a guf and a neshama meet, there's a certain interface, certain meaning. And what's the basis for the meeting? When this unit is examined, what do you see? Do you see predominantly neshama or do you see predominantly guf? This embodiment represents ruach or represents geshem? Of course, the answer always is a little bit of both. But what's the preeminent component? Which is the predominant one? Which is more important? You know, the story when the Rebbe was sitting Shiva, to the Rebbe Tzimlei Aleinu, and the way I heard the story at the time, everybody, all of Anash, the mosquitoes were very worried about the Rebbe's health, because of course the Rebbe had looked after the Rebbe, and they needed somebody to suggest to the Rebbe that he take care of himself. So the person who was given this very, very unpleasant task was the Rosh Yeshiva. Harav Pekarsky, Rabbi Yitzchak Pekarsky, was a very big Gaon, and he was an Elder Rid, he was from the previous generation. And he had a very special relationship with the Rebbe, and he was asked to say something to the Rebbe about watching his health. And the Rebbe's response to him was, why should I watch my health? I'm healthy. Now, the Rebbe didn't say, why should I watch my health? He sort of indicated, why are you even saying it? I'm healthy. And he said immediately, the Rebbe, the Schwer gesagt, a gesunter fühlt nicht sein Guf. The previous Rebbe said, the healthy person doesn't feel his body. He feels only his soul. And because I don't feel my body, I know I'm healthy, so I don't need a doctor. I don't need to even be told to take care of myself. In quotes, I'm doing fine. That was kind of what the Rebbe said to him. Now, what does that mean? The Rebbe, the Schwer gesagt, a gesunter fühlt nicht sein Guf. What does that mean? It means there's a meaning to the body and a soul. The body is death. The soul is life. The fusion of body and soul is a convergence of life and death, so that the dead becomes living, and the living become confined to a material which is in and of itself dead. If a person is healthy, the body does not interfere with the neshama at all, and the soul radiates through, and the person feels immortal. Young people think they're never going to die because they feel immortal. They feel they're going to live forever. And it's true, because what they're feeling is their neshama, and the neshama does live forever. It's the body that dies. But the moment you have a michosh, you have a splinter, you have an ingrown toenail, you have a cut, the smallest deficiency in the body which makes you pay attention to the material of your life, so you no longer feel like life is forever. You no longer feel the immortality of the soul, because the body is obstructing it. And of course, as a person ages and the body begins to break down, they feel the body more and more, and they feel the soul less and less. Now, the Rebbe was 89 years old when he said, or 87 years old when he said, I don't feel my body. And I guess part of that is because he's the Rebbe. So the meeting between the soul and the body is such that there are instances where you feel soul much, much more, and the body is almost unnoticed. And there are instances where you feel the body very, very much, and the soul is very, very compromised by the body. And this is the discussion that's on the table at hand. Because what our Maamar is talking about is letters. Now, if you can remember, our Maamar is talking about written letters versus carved letters. Letters are letters. And according to the introduction that I gave you, every kind of letter, including a carved letter, is a distinctive letter. The point of the Maamar is that carved letters are so one with the thing onto which they're carved that they represent an infinity. Even though they're distinct letters, they represent an infinity, and that's what makes a person a mahalach, as you're going to see later on. So the issue is that on the highest levels, although everything that exists is a combination of a guf and a neshama, light and an idea, light and words, on the highest levels, the body half of the fusion is almost not noticed. It's as if it doesn't exist, although it's present. And all that comes through is the light aspect, the neshama aspect, the ruchnius aspect. And on the lower levels, it's the other way around. So let me talk you through this, okay? The classic example for the meeting between a body and a soul, where the body is pronounced, is in speech. What is the difference between a person who's thinking and a person who's speaking? What's the difference between me thinking an idea in my mind and speaking to you? So the obvious difference, of course, is when I'm thinking an idea in my mind, I'm talking to myself, I understand myself quite well, so I can speak any way I want as long as I know what I'm talking about. When I'm talking to you, it's not enough that I speak. You need to hear, you need to understand. So speech is not only different. So first of all, speech is different than thought. Thought, I'm speaking to myself. In speech, I'm speaking to you. But there's another big difference. When someone is thinking for himself, it's much easier for him to understand himself. When someone is speaking to another, he has to pay much, much more attention to what he says. In other words, to how he says it, as opposed to only what he's saying it, so the person should be able to hear it. In English, the expression is that in public speaking, they always tell you, sacrifice form for substance. Chitzonius for pneumius. Because you want to reach your audience, you want to be entertaining. So I'll explain to you what that means. In other words, the moment a person speaks, he's focusing on his words. A person can be brilliant. A person can have very, very meaningful things to say. But when he's speaking, he's not only thinking about what he's saying, he's thinking about how it comes out. So a very bright person, very intelligent person, whose mind is filled with the light of many ideas, when he is communicating to somebody else, he has to decide what he's going to say, and he has to pay close attention to how he says it. Meaning to say, you're busy with the words. In speech, you are preoccupied with the form. It's at least as important how you say it as what you are saying. Which means, in other words, that in the world of speech, the guf predominates over the neshama. I am sharing an idea with you. But because I'm talking to you, I'm paying more attention to the you aspect of the communication than to the idea aspect of the communication. It's as important that the words be chosen precisely and constructively for the recipient, for the listener, for the hearer, to benefit from it as the idea which is being communicated. So what's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that words of speech can only tolerate a certain echos, a certain quality of an idea. In other words, words are one of those things, to use an old cliche, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. Words are very, very helpful. Communication is amazing. You just look at animals who can't speak. Animals who have great memories and have great imagination, but they can't speak, they can't share. It's a prison. Words are an amazing thing. Words allow us to share ideas and feelings and experiences on a very, very deep level. But words never really do justice to the subtlety and the nuance and the feel of an idea and a feeling which exists in the neshama of the person communicating it. Because words are poor. Words are unbelievably helpful, but they're not helpful enough. In other words, the body which is going to carry the soul, the keli, the ois, which is going to carry the oir and the chayes to communicate to somebody else, is very, very helpful in sharing the oir, but to a limited degree, to the extent that esis hadibur, that spoken words, can carry the light of a concept, and there's always going to be the issue of what I was not able to say. And in Maamar Chassidus, we've had this in Likutei Torah also, they give the example that in the Sanhedrin, when they would have a case of din in nefashos, capital case, it couldn't be paskened at night. So when the sun fell, they couldn't go to sleep. They had to stay up all night and discuss it. And the following morning, they would make the psak din when the sun rose. Why couldn't they come back in the morning and read the notes? They had stenographers, they had people who wrote divrei hamazakim, divrei hamachayvin, and the expression which is brought by Maamar Chassidus, which is a bit difficult to find in the Shas, is tavna de liba le kasve inche. Tavna means the colors of the heart, the flavor, the sentiment, the feeling of the heart is not written down. You can say to somebody what you think, but there is a certain nuance, a certain edelkeit, a certain subtlety to what you're saying which the words don't carry. And when you'll come back the next morning and read your own words, you'll say, I didn't say this, I said something different. No, you said precisely this, because there's something lost. What's lost? There's an edelkeit, there's a refined level of light, in quotations, that's a part of the idea that you communicate that's not reflected in the words. Because words, which are so helpful sharing and communicating and revealing also are a limitation. And words of speech represent this limitation most profoundly, because when a person speaks words, they're preoccupied with how they're saying what they're saying, as much as they're preoccupied with what they're trying to say, which is an enormous limitation. That's why there are people in this world who are very bright. They can't speak. They can't communicate. Because words don't carry their thoughts. And they don't have the ability to be mitzamtzem themselves, to contain themselves, and to say, okay, I can't tell you everything I'm thinking and feeling, but I can tell you a percentage of what I'm thinking and feeling, but this is how I'm going to say it to you, for you to be able to receive it and to perceive it. So oisies hadibur, the spoken word, and of course the written word is even more so, is a symbol, is a representation of where a body is carrying a soul and obstructing it and blocking it. And the opposite of that is thought. When you think an idea, of course you're thinking with words and images and form. Like the example of the flashlight beam with the particles floating inside. You vacuum those particles out, the light disappears. You cannot think without images, without words, without thoughts, without form. But you're so focused on the theory, on the light, on the spirit, that you're preoccupied with, that the fact that you're thinking in images and forms is almost unknown to you. A person who's concentrating, a person who's thinking an idea, of course he's thinking with images, with forms, with letters, with a body. Otherwise it wouldn't exist to him. But to use a classic Hasidic terminology, the oisies are totally bottled to the earth. The letters that are carrying that light are totally nullified to the light that they're carrying, because the predominance is on the ruchnis. And there are many levels of the neshama. And each level of the neshama has a different level of oisies, of letters that bring it forward. In other words, you cannot experience a tainug of the neshama without oisies. You cannot experience a ratzon of the neshama without oisies. You cannot experience a chochma of the neshama without oisies. You cannot experience a bina of the neshama without oisies. In every level of the neshama there's oisies. And like I told you earlier, every level of the neshama is oisies. Hashem creates separately. And they all exist in the nefesh till atmas amusa in baruch Hu. But on the higher levels, the meaning of oir and oisius is so refined that all you feel is oir. And at the lowest level, the meaning in oir and oisius is so material that you feel the oisius much more, or perhaps you feel the oisius completely. So what's the cutoff point? What's the point at which this shifts? So in Tanya, Perek Chaf, which is where in Tanya this idea is brought, Tanya is very simple. You speak in words, you think in words. You don't reason and feel in words. In other words, in Tanya, the cutoff point is you speak with words where the focus is on the words. You think with words where the focus is also on the words, even though they're finer. You feel and you reason, your midas and your seichel are without words. In other words, when you say the word thought, there's two different concepts. And this is going to be very well developed in our mind. When you say the word thought, there's two different concepts. One idea of thought is I'm thinking a concept. Another idea of thought is I'm thinking how to say a concept. Or I think how to practically apply a concept. Like if you have in your mind the image of a car, you'd be thinking how to make it practical. The first concept is considered higher than thought. The second concept is the concept of thought. In other words, the level of the nefesh, which is called thought, machshava, is representing thinking how you're going to say something or thinking how you're going to do something. So on the level of thought, where thinking is planning what you're going to do or say and so forth and so on, the oisies are separate from the oir as well. On the other hand, when you're thinking a concept, and you're totally focused on the idea, and not at all paying attention to, so to speak, how it sounds to you, that's considered higher than machshava. It's called seichel, it's called midas, and so forth. So in Tanya, the line is drawn. There's eisius ha'maisa, there's eisius ha'dibur, there's eisius ha'machshava. Above machshava, there's no eisius. In the Maamorim, the line is drawn between pnimiyas bina and chitzenias bina. Pnimiyas bina, the eisius are bottled to the air. Beginning with chitzenias bina, the eisius begin to become a metzias. This is a mystical thing. This is in the nefesh. In other words, the higher levels of the neshama, light and ideas, light and form meet in such a way where all that you experience is the light. The form is so nullified to the light that is carrying it, as if it isn't there. Beginning with chitzenias bina, which is a level of thought, which is then going to trickle down to speech, to dibur. There's a reality to the oasis which is separate from the oir. The form, the words that are carrying the light and the meaning and the substance and the spirit predominate to an extent, and you become aware of the words. And as I said earlier, if the neshama has 100 levels, there's 100 different types of words. If in Hishtalshalos there's 100 worlds, there's 100 different types of kelim. If in the neshama there's 1,000 levels, if in Hishtalshalos there's 1,000 worlds, every world, every reality has its own oisius, which accommodates oid in its own way. And each one of these oisius exists still atzma samhuz. And like I said before, in the lowest levels, the oisius becomes identified, almost taking over, predominating the meeting between the oid and the oisius. And on the higher levels, it's the other way around. So now, let's talk about our Maamar. Our Maamar says, "Im Bechukosei telechu." There's different levels of letters, and of course, the Maamar discusses only two: carved letters and written letters and oral letters. But theoretically, there's an infinite number of levels of letters, depending if there's infinite world, there's infinite letters. But in a general context, there is carved letters and there's written letters and there's spoken letters. And the pasuk is saying, "Im Bechukosei." When a person reaches a level where he's involved with letters that are called carved as opposed to written, he becomes a mahalach. In other words, when you're dealing with letters on a lower level, so the letters are very felt, even though those letters are carrying an idea, an oir, but there's a predominance, there's a feeling of the letters that's very, very limiting. But on higher levels, where the light is stronger and the vessels, the words that carry them are more bottle, so you don't feel the words and letters, you don't feel the form and the body, you feel only the light. So relatively speaking, this is chakika versus ksiva. Written letters are very separate. Separate not only from one another, but separate from the light they're carrying. In other words, the light which they reveal. The ideas that the spoken and the written word speak are being spoken in such a way where the words are real. They're an interference, they're a disturbance, they're a limitation. On the higher levels, for example, the higher levels of thought, and in the language of this Maamar, carved letters, there's also letters. But you're not sensing the letters, you're sensing only the light. So it's very, very important for you to get the following point. The Maamar is not going to say it explicitly, but it's clearly implicit. What's the difference between lower letters and higher letters? Letters on a lower level are more separate from one another. Letters on a lower level are more separate from the light they carry. Letters on a lower level are more separate from the neshama of which they came. Letters on a higher level are less separate from one another. They're less separate from the ideas that they carry and less separate from the nefesh from which they came. But it's only a difference in degree. The highest letters are letters. Oisies in atzmus hus are klal prat, not etzem v'hispashtus. To the deepest levels of the neshama, until the very, very essence of the neshama, letters are always distinct. They're all separate from one another. They're separate from other levels, and they're separate from their ideas. Therefore, when you say there's lower letters which are called written, which are very limiting, and therefore when you're connecting to Hashem and you're connecting to His Torah on a level of the written Torah, you're a oimed, you're standing still because your relationship with the Eid of Elikus is as a separate entity. As opposed to when you're in a level of Eishes Hakika, which means to say you're relating to the Torah on a higher level, as if the letters are carved into your nefesh. You and the letters of the Torah become one and the same, or the light of the Torah and the Eishes of the nefesh become one and the same. So you're one with the godliness of the Torah, and therefore you become a mahalach. You have to understand what that means. Eishes Hakika are not nefesh. Eishes Hakika are also Eishes. Even though the higher level of letters is more bottled to the Yoyer, and is more unified with the other letters of its own type, and is more unified with other types of Eisius, it's not really oneness. There's no such thing as real oneness in Eisius. Eisius are always separate. So the idea that Chakika makes you a Mahalach and Ksiva makes you an Oimid is not because at the level of Eisias Chakika there's no Eisias. It's only because at the level of Eisias Chakika the Eisias are bottled. And they're so bottled that the Eisias are not at all felt. You feel only Eir, and that's the Koyach for the Hilo. So it's a bit of a subtlety here. If you serve Hashem on a level, let's use these words, where your body, compared to the godliness which is manifest in your body, is like written letters. In other words, your body is separate from the oil which you're carrying, you're an Oimid. But if your body would be like Eisias Hakika, which is one with the light of godliness which you're carrying, you become a Mahalech. It doesn't mean that Eisias Hakika are not separate from the Yair. There's always separate from the Yair. And they're always separate from one another. They're simply more bottled to the Yair. Because the idea of Eisias, the idea of bodies, the idea of letters, the idea of vessels is separate till Atzmas and Hus Mamish. So Bechukosei Telech was Eisias. And Eisias are always going to be Nifrad. They're always going to be in the system of Klal Prat and never in the system of Helam and Gili or Yuli and Gili or Etzem Vespashtas. They're always going to be separate from each other and from the ideas and from the Nefesh. But on the higher levels, they're going to be more bottle. And by the virtue of the fact that they're more bottle, they're a Keli for Ein Seif. And I apologize, I had planned to learn so much more of the text, but the introduction took all this time, and the next week we'll read inside what we just lectured, we just discussed.